Joan Jonas, convicted in the Cold Lake Massacre, has just been released from prison. Oh, God. Abby's knees went weak. The reporter was speaking, and Abbey tried to concentrate. That's right, Elliot. We just learned that Joan Jonas walked out of this prison earlier this afternoon. He'd been originally scheduled to be released later this week, and we don't yet know why the date was changed, but... The rest of the report was a blur. Abbey stared at the screen, not seeing the news desk or reporter, or even the prison, not hearing the report. Instead, she was caught on the web of images of that frigid, horrid night. Her mind spun to what she did remember: the red and blue lights of the police vehicles, strobes to reflect on the snow. Joan, bloody and unconscious on a stretcher, is carried to an ambulance, her wet hairband and near-frozen skin as she was. Wrapped in a towel by a woman police officer, dozens of them surrounded the house. Yellow tape, one end flapping beneath the low-hanging branches of a snow-laden fir. She'd been in shock, but unhurt. A doctor in the ER had said to a kind, heavy-set woman from Child Services who wore a hand-knit stocking cap and smelled of lavender. Aunt Fiza had rushed into the police station, her face red. She tried not to cry, but had failed miserably. Shaking and sobbing, she'd held a numb and silent Abbey tight. Now Abbey blinked, realizing tears had drizzled down her cheeks. Angrily, she swiped them away. Joan was free? How had she not known? Why hadn't someone contacted her? Oh, right. How many calls did you refuse to answer and delete? Absently, she took a swallow from her glass. She saw that her hand was shaking, the wine sloshing wildly. Calm down. So he's out. So what? You don't think he's a killer, do you? She bit her lip. Oh, Abbey, have you been lying to yourself all this time? Shut up, she said, and stood, spilling some of the Merlot, as she walked to the sink and poured the remainder of the wine down the drain. She glanced out the window, to the dark night beyond, and saw not only the flickering images of the TV in the glass, but her reflection there like death. Her eyes large and sunken, her cheeks hollow. Who was she kidding? Not Aunt Fiza, not Dr. Joe, not even herself if she were truthful. She was the same terrified girl who had been locked in the attic 20 years earlier, the girl who had witnessed the bloody aftermath of her family's slaughter. Though Joan had been the one on trial, Abbey had felt as if she, too, was judged. It had been long ago, and yet close enough that she felt as if she could reach out and touch it, as if it had been just yesterday. At 8 years old, she'd sat on the hard chair on a witness stand, terrified, afraid she would say the wrong thing. She'd been coached and was smart, older than her years, Auntie Fi had said, but still. The judge, a dark-skinned woman in black robes and rimless glasses, had been seated high above her, sharp eyes assessing as the attorneys asked questions she barely understood, but knew the answers, had been primed with the right way to respond. They had approached her, had smiled, and had outwardly appeared to be friendly. As IAC was, she'd known better, instinctively, had sensed a darker purpose in their questions. She remembered forcing herself to meet their gazes, to appear calm, while her fingers, as if of their own accord, had rubbed together endlessly. It seemed to go on forever. Now, 2 decades later, Abbey tried to shake off the feeling of being trapped that had been with her on that witness stand, to put it behind her and concentrate on the television screen. As an adult, she knew a lot more about what had happened and understood that she, a shell-shocked 8-year-old, had been manipulated, played by the prosecutors, by the defense attorneys, by her aunt, by every damned one. She reached for her empty glass in the sink, thought better of it, and walked back to the TV area. She backed up the program, starting over again, with the reporter standing at the gates of the prison. Mesmerized, she watched as the jacketed reporter on the screen was wrapping up and signing off. "Back to you, Elliot," she said, snowflakes collecting in her hair as the prison loomed behind her. Abbey's stomach twisted. Bahnhof Prison had been Joan's home for all of her adult life. Her cell buzzed, and she tore her gaze from the TV to check the phone's tiny screen. Aunt Fiza's name appeared. Again. Great! She wasn't in the mood to talk to the woman who had raised her. A woman as different from Mama as night to day. It was hard to believe they had been sisters. Stubborn as a mule, Mama had confided once while lighting a cigarette on the broad back porch of their city home, and determined. Let me tell you, Abby, don't try to talk her out of anything. It's a waste of breath. She'd taken a deep drag from her Virginia Slim, then exhaled and waved the smoke away. I tried to tell her about Roger, but would she listen? Hell no. Mama's eyebrows had pulled together then, as she'd smoked. Mama had never liked Uncle Roger, Fiza's boyfriend. Abby hadn't understood it then. At the time, Roger had been tall and slim like Daddy, but he'd had thick brown hair and pale blue eyes that flashed in his perpetual tan, while Daddy had black hair that curled a little, and light brown eyes that had seemed to look past everyone's facade and see right to the heart of them. But then Abby had lived with Fiza and Roger all of her preteen and high school years, and she'd seen Roger for what he read. A man who could never hold a job, a man with huge appetites, and, Abby suspected, even bigger secrets. The phone rang in her hand again, and Abby snapped back to the present, and gritting her teeth, said, Fiza! There you are. I've been calling all afternoon. Yeah, sorry. Then he asked, I had just caught the news. Is Joan really out of prison? Why do you think I've been trying to reach you? Fiza asked frantically. Why didn't you pick it up? I've been busy. Doing what? Fiza asked suspiciously. What could be so important that you couldn't answer the phone or text me back? What did it matter? Joan was out of prison. But Abby answered, working, not real. Fiza let out a soft humph. A brassier blonde than Mama had been, Fiza wore her hair curly and sprayed so that it fanned out around her face, where she'd always applied what Abby's mother had referred to as extreme makeup. She never got over the ultra-glam of the 80s, Mama had confided. If Fiza had her way, she'd have curly hair on her shoulders, out there bang jackets with huge shoulder pads. She hadn't toned it down much over the years. Working, she repeated with more than a little edge of doubt. She knew Fiza didn't think her working as a substitute teacher was a serious job for a woman in her late 20s, and had said so often enough. Too bad. Abby had learned after college that she wasn't cut out for an elementary classroom. Too bad she'd learned that sorry fact while teaching a student, and had already earned her degree. Another fact Fiza hadn't understood. Why didn't you change your major? She'd asked 100 times over. Why didn't I? Abby had always thrown back at her, not ever explaining that once she'd been on a path, she wanted to just get done with it, through college as quickly as possible. The degree had been a requirement for her to inherit her portion of her parents' estate, and she'd earned it in 3 years rather than 4, because college life hadn't been for her. She'd holed up in her dorm room, then apartment, and studied, unable to ever get into the swing of campus life, and even put in the extra hours and another year for her master's. Another requirement is to gain her inheritance according to her parents' wills. Now wasn't the time to dwell on it. Not with her brother out of stir. So Joan is. Where? Unknown, so far. But he'll turn up, let me tell you, like a damned bad penny. But... Listen, you probably would have been the first to know if you'd taken the time to pick up the damned phone. Fiza sounded put out. You must have seen that I called and heard my message. Or read my damned texts. I've also had a few appointments. At least that wasn't a lie. Before Dr. Joe, Abby had visited her accountant and learned just how badly her once healthy trust fund had dwindled, significantly. Yeah, it had just been a stellar day. Abby's stomach twisted. She peeled herself from the couch, and with Rhapsody at her heels, made her way to the kitchen, where she poured herself another big glass of wine. No restaurant pays for her, not while dealing with Fiza. Fiza said, I tried to let you know, to warn you that Joan was getting out. I knew he was going to be released. You'd have to live in Outer Mongolia not to know that, Abbey snapped. Faiza ignored her sarcasm. I meant today. I thought it was scheduled for next week. So did I. But that was wrong. But it changed somehow. Who knows? Now he's a free half-brother. She distastefully, as if the words were bitter. And believe it or not, he had the nerve to call me. Your mother's sister. That murderer. She stopped herself, and Abbey heard her take in an audible deep breath. He's your brother. Who claims he's innocent? There was a snort at the other end of the line. That's what they all say. Abbey kept sipping as her aunt added softly, He wanted your number. What? Abbey choked on her wine, spilling the red liquid on her pajamas and the kitchen floor. You didn't give it to him, she sputtered. She wasn't ready to face Joan, not without a wall of thick prison glass between them. A pause. Faiza, Abbey prodded. What was I supposed to do? Her aunt asked rhetorically. He was going to get it anyway. I don't want to talk to him. Who does? But Auntie F.A., as Abbey had called her while growing up, did sound a little contrite. Okay. Look, I'm sorry, really. But one way or another, you're going to have to face him, face what he did. He's the reason, Abbey, for everything that happened. I don't believe it. You never have, but I'm serious here. Even though the police screw up, Joan Jonas is an insane killer. He's your nephew. No, honey, I'm not related to him at all. My sister was married to her father for 8 years, but I never liked that kid. Never. Always thought there was something wrong with him. His mother. Well, that has nothing to do with this, I suppose. Look, I've got to run now, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. Wait. Suddenly, Abbey wanted more information from her aunt. Seriously, Roger's in the car waiting. Oh, Christ. He just honked the damned horn. Her voice was suddenly muffled. I'm coming. Hold on, she said on the phone. Later, hun. I've got to go. Before Abbey could object, Faiza disconnected. Abbey wiped the wine from the floor with a wet paper towel, dabbed at the stains on her pajamas, and took another drink. The bottle, now close to empty, was sitting near the newspaper she'd left on the counter. Eyeing the front page, Abbey cringed. The page one story above the fold was all about the grisly murders 20 years earlier. Pictures had been included, the largest being the mountain cabin, as it had been the night of the tragedy, shots of police swarming the frozen grounds. A second photograph was Joan's mugshot, him staring sullenly at the camera, his dark hair slicked away from his face, the grim countenance of a would-be family annihilator. The last shot brought a catch to Abbey's throat as she stared at a familiar picture of her mother and father's wedding. The tall groom was surrounded by his preteen boys, all in tuxedos, all with slicked-back dark hair. A story was a story. The bride was flanked by a man-haired her in a matching tuxedo, while her younger sister was in a long silver dress, her pale blonde hair pinned atop her head. The bride was dressed in a flowing ivory gown that effectively hid the early months of her pregnancy. Yes, Abbey thought she had been at the wedding too, a small baby bump that was the reason for her parents' quick marriage after hasty divorces from their previous spouses. She stared at the photograph, skimmed through the fastening on her, and into the trash. She didn't need to read about the Cold Lake Massacre. She'd had the bad luck to live through it. Welcome threw his cell phone onto the chair across the room. He'd called the number he'd gotten for Abbey Jonas 3 times, each getting a toneless voicemail response asking him to leave his number. He had twice, but no more. There had to be another way to get a cabin to stare through the trees at the lake, iced over as it had been all those years ago. So Abbey Jonas was avoiding him. So what? It wasn't exactly a newsflash. She'd been avoiding him, and practically cutting herself off from the whole damned world, all of her life. And now, just because her brother was being released from the 2 decades of incarceration, would she suddenly open up? Grant him an interview? You're dreaming! Not that he blamed her. The horror of that night hasn't been washed away over the years. He himself had been a part of it. He imagined his father standing about where he was, when he'd heard noises from the neighboring property that had propelled him to attention. If Abbey knew anything, even if there was something locked in her subconscious, he had no way of asking her. She wasn't about to open up to him, and he couldn't outreach him. His life turned inside out and upside down after living through the terror of the Cold Lake Massacre, a tragedy that had involved every member of his family. Would he want to relive the terror of that night? Would he want to remember the trial where her testimony put her brother behind bars for what should have been life? Would he want to face said brother? Hell no. But he wasn't about to give up. If he put her through it, well, as they used to say, dems de breaks. A story was a story. Is a bedtime story just a story to him? This one cut close to the bone, seeing as his father had given his life to save the freaked-out only child of Samuel and Zelda Jonas. Cal Civic Flee Dubai. Big time. He remembered her as a kid, all ganglia arms and legs, mussed hair, and even then showing an attitude through the innocence of childhood. She'd snuck up on him once, watching from the shadows of the tree line as he'd been skipping stones across the water. He'd caught her eye. "Want to try?" he'd asked, and expected her to run like a frightened fawn into the underbrush. Instead, she'd stepped from the umbra, grabbed a smooth round stone, hauled her arm back, released it with a flip of her wrist, and sent the rock sailing, bouncing easily over the silvery surface. 10 firm skips, water rippling in circles from the spots where the stone had bounced. With a startling series of quacks and wild splash, 2 wood ducks flapped out of the water and took off into the high, thin summer clouds. "You're pretty good," he'd said, unable to hide his surprise. "Well, what is it?" She'd cocked an insolent eyebrow. "Pretty or good?" "What?" "I'm pretty," she'd asserted. "And I'm God, better than you, damn." After drilling him with a stark, knowing stare, she'd taken off, leaving him speechless. She'd been 7 or 8 at the time, precocious, older than her years, because all of her older half-siblings probably knew that no 7-year-old should, even before witnessing the aftermath of the slaughter of her family. Now he walked to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of beer from the old refrigerator, cracked it open, and looked around the living area, left as it had been years before. His father's presence still evident. A family picture still hung over the mantel, and nearby the antlers of a deer headshot with a bow. And in the short hallway leading to the bedrooms, a framed military shadow box with a collection of Jackson Cole's badges in the Marine Corps. A true hero, Wesley thought, as he headed out to the back porch, where the floorboards were rotting and the brisk winter air cut like a knife. This was the very porch his father had stood on all those years ago. Jackson had been smoking a cigarette when he'd heard the commotion at the neighboring house, gone over to investigate, and found a freaked-out little girl in the middle of the carnage of a family slaughter. Wesley had been 11 at the time, old enough to be fascinated by the horror, young enough to blame the victim like everyone else, vulnerable to feel the loss of a father dying while helping others. Jack's off-duty, yet he'd sacrificed his life for the girl, running onto the ice as it cracked and gave way beneath his weight. Jackson had been able to save her, dragging her kicking, screaming and choking from the freezing water before having a heart attack and collapsing on the snowy shore. Thinking of it now, Cole's jaw turned rock hard, his eyes narrowing, the anger that had been with him for 20 years festering. He'd never gotten to say goodbye to his dad. Jackson had barely spoken a word before coming in the ambulance as it screamed its way to the nearest hospital, where Jackson Cole pronounced DOD, one more victim of the bloody massacre. Even today, in what seemed a lifetime later, Wesley felt his tea and his jaw set. He'd been robbed of the father he remembered all too clearly. Jackson had been a big man, overweight and a smoker, but only 47 years old when he'd taken that fateful plunge into the icy water. Cole's hands clenched over the bottle. He stared at the ice-covered lake, its smooth surface stretching for half a mile, though tonight the view was cloaked by falling snow. The houses on the far shore were indiscernible, no lights from windows piercing the whispering veil. He tipped up his bottle and took a long swallow. a cold wind rattling the trees and swirling the icy flakes. That damned lake. He'd loved coming here as a kid with his parents and younger sister. It had been a sanctuary, a haven away from the city, a place to explore in times when their small family had bonded and his father's work was miles away. He'd fished from the old dock, hunted in the surrounding woods, and played one-on-one at the rusted hoop planted in the sparse gravel. How many times had the old man let him win? Of course, that was before the night that had changed everything, he thought, shivering in his stockinged feet. His love for this place had soured, the sanctuary turning to a hated place, heaven turning into hell in the space of a heartbeat. Nothing in life is fair. His mother had reminded him when he'd complained. He died doing what he loved, protecting others. Of course, Cole Hayden was devastated too, hiding her bitterness from her children, standing proudly in the icy rain at her husband's burial, and forcing a smile she didn't feel when she was presented with a flag, as Jackson had served in the Marines before becoming a cop and marrying his high school sweetheart. Detective Cole Thomas was pissed. Pissed. No way that murdering bastard Joan Jonas should be out of prison. No way. Jonas was the single worst murderer to have ever set foot in Hatfield County, and he should have been locked up for the rest of his natural life. But no. Once again, the system had failed. He muttered under his breath as he glared at the computer screen mounted on his desk and swore a blue streak just as he heard footsteps, the sound of his partner as she approached. "Good day?" she asked, sliding her arms through the thick sleeves of a ski jacket as she paused at his office. The department was slowing down for the night, with a few fewer shift cops still hanging out while the night crew was taking over. From somewhere near the break room, he heard a ripple of laughter and, farther off, the sound of a heavy door banging shut. "Yeah, right. The best," he growled, setting the coffee back on his desk. Aramis Johnson sent him a wry grin and shook her head, her black hair scraped into some kind of bun gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. Tall and slim, her features sharp, her mocha-colored skin flawless. She could have been a runway model, he thought, not for the first time. Instead, Johnson was a cop. And, he had to admit grudgingly, a good one. Those gorgeous near-black eyes didn't miss much. He didn't know why she'd joined the force, but he suspected it might have something to do with her special needs child, who didn't seem to have a father, at least not one he knew about. "Let me guess. You're not happy with Joan Jonas being released. You must be a detective. Lighten up." She flashed him a quick smile as two uniforms passed by his open door, their conversation low and intense, the taller scratching his crown before squaring his cap on his head. "Short-cropped lighten up? Really? Even though a family annihilator is now walking free. No, wait," he held up a finger. "Make that a convicted family annihilator." Thomas's desk phone rang. He recognized the number. Didn't answer. Within seconds, his cell phone buzzed. Same number. He ignored it. "You under the radar?" Johnson asked, leaning a hip against his desk. "Not picking up?" "Reporter. In your cell too?" "Yeah, somehow she's got my private number." "Somehow?" Johnson repeated, arching a suspicious eyebrow. "She?" "Yeah." Of course, she didn't go there. Sheila Keegan could stand in line and talk to the PIO with the rest of the TV and newspaper people. That's why the department had a public information officer, wasn't it? To deal with the press. Far better than for detectives who'd crossed that invisible professional line and gotten involved with a reporter. He closed his mind to that way of thinking, turned his thoughts back to Joan Jonas, who, in Thomas's opinion, was a merciless killer who had murdered his entire family. He flipped open the file. "This is all on the computer, you know," Aramis pointed out. "Yeah, pull it up." He hitched his chin toward the screen, where Joan Jonas's mugshot was visible. A gaunt kid of 18 with sunken eyes as dark as and standard in his thin beard shadow. More apparent was the attitude, visible in the tight, challenging set of his jaw, and the compacted lips. Cruel, thin lips. "What motivates a kid like that?" she said, eyeing the monitor. Don't know. Whatever he told his psychiatrist, it's privileged. Same with his lawyer, so we're left to guess. Is he dangerous? You tell me. He glanced up at her from his desk chair. A teenager who murders nearly everyone in his entire family? You think he's gotten better after spending half his life in the big house with convicts? She lifted a shoulder. He found God. Don't they all? Ooh, Johnson said. Bitter, my man. Am I? I wonder why. This guy. Thomas tapped the image on the screen with his index finger. Hacked up his whole damned family with a sword. His father, his stepmother, his brother, and his stepbrother. Not his whole family. Okay, fine. One little girl survived. And another went missing. My sister Isabella, right? Aramis picked up the file and rifled through it. She was what? Oh, here it is. 17. Jesus. Stepsister. Thomas turned away from the computer, and the dead look in Joan Joidawaras's was what she asked, her eyebrows drawing together. Not since that time. Well, that I know of. He didn't have to look at the file again. He'd already tucked the information about Sam Sr.'s family away. So then, as that marriage is crumbling because of the loss of the baby, Sam raised 2. Before divorcing number 1? That seemed to be his M.O., both times. Ouch, she said. I don't imagine that went over well with the exes. Probably not. And Joan? He was from the second wife? Yeah, Joan is Natalie's kid. Even saying the killer's name left a bad taste in his mouth. What happened to the previous Mrs. Jonas's? Johnson picked up the worn manila file. Remarried, I think. Both of them? Not sure. So, Zelda Donner Robinson was number 3. Johnson was flipping through the musty pages of the file, her eyes skimming the notes. Her hip balanced against the edge of his desk as the old furnace rumbled from ducts overhead, and she came on her own. Right. She was the mother of Isabella and Donner Robinson, along with Abby, the only kid they shared between them. She glanced up as he nodded. Right. Zelda's first husband was Walter Robinson. And how did he get tossed over for a new model? Thomas shrugged. About the same as Samuel's ex-wives did, I think. As far as anyone knew, they all got along. Got along? She repeated. You mean as if they didn't make waves, were cordial, but didn't hang out and go on vacations or spend holidays together? Right. At the mention of the holidays, he thought again of that final bloody Christmas, but didn't have to mention it. He suspected Johnson was on the same wavelength. She scanned a few more pages. In this blended family, all the kids were basic, except for the littlest daughter, he reminded her, the one supposedly locked in the attic. Right, he said, conjuring up the image of a small girl in the witness box, all blonde curls, big eyes, and wan cheeks. Abby had answered each question in a tiny voice, chewed on her lip, and kept the courtroom wrapped, Thomas remembered. The usually noisy chamber had been silent as a tomb, not so much as the rustle of a paper or a shoe scraping, as that tiny waif of a girl had recounted what she'd seen in a thin whispered voice, her answers prompted by the DA. Abby, white-faced, had stared at Joan, her chin trembling, as if she was about to break down, and desperately wanted his forgiveness. Cole Thomas himself had been in the second row of the courtroom, a rookie cop who still believed that only bad guys were sent to prison, that the system never failed. Now, years later, he wasn't sure. Johnson was still reading. Abby insisted her older sister lock her on the 3rd floor, and she somehow escaped only to find her family slaughtered. Johnson's eyebrows drew together. She said she thought the intruder had come back into the house, so she took off through the kitchen, ran out the back door, and down a path that dead-ended at the lake. She tried to cross the ice, ended up falling in, and the intruder she'd been running from turned out to be a cop coming to see what all the screaming was about. Jackson Cole, off-duty, a good one. Had been a Marine. Hero type. Thomas nodded. Saved the kid, and ended up having a massive heart attack himself and dying. She was slowly pacing in front of his desk, absorbing all the information in the old file, the wheels in her head. Despite what the paramedics did, he was DOA in the emergency room. Sweet Jesus! She shook her head, dark hair glistening under the light. She looked up, skewering him with those near-black eyes. So, no intruder? None found. Aramis fingered her cross as she skimmed through the reports. Abbey always claimed her brother was innocent, but no one bought it. Because of her testimony. Her eyes narrowed, and she chewed on her lip. Yep, that's the conundrum. What she witnessed and testified to didn't jibe with what she felt or thought about Joan. Probably she just couldn't believe her brother could be so savage and brutal. Nah. And a murderer. Right? She quit fiddling with the cross and stopped pacing. His prints were all over the murder weapon. Uh-huh. Thomas leaned back in his chair until it squeaked in protest. You see the motive? Frowning more deeply, she nodded. Jealousy. Of his older stepbrother, Donner. Dear God, testosterone at its worst, she muttered with a long-suffering sigh. So Donner was involved with Joan's girlfriend? Apparently. How involved? Intimate, one eyebrow arched a little higher. Let me guess. Joan was not cool with it. Who would it be? Lord Almighty. And it seemed like a prayer, barely audible over the sound of air whooshing through the vents and conversations in the outer hallway. Thomas knew what she was reading, because he had nearly memorized the case file, and as she skimmed the documents, they played over in his mind. Joan Jonas, who miraculously survived the deadly assault, swore to this day that he was innocent of any homicides that were pinned on him. Yes, he'd admitted when the police had arrived, he had picked up the old sword mounted on the wall of his bedroom. Joan claimed that he'd been messing around with the weapon earlier in the day and had left it on the floor of his room. According to Joan, Isabella had even walked past the bedroom earlier and had spied him on it. That's why his fingerprints were all over the hilt. Of course, she had conveniently gone missing, so that fact couldn't be proved.